Okay, welcome everybody. One straggler in stylish glasses searching for a seat. Sorry, Ian, to the back, please. Okay, how's that, Em? Okay, all right. Better? Thank you. Okay, thank you everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2023 Henry George Commemorative Dinner and Address, which is the 132nd such event hosted by Prosper Australia and its predecessors. So my name is Tim Helm. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at Prosper. I want to acknowledge before we begin that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, so we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We also, here at Prosper, acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout all of Australia. We acknowledge their connection to the land, and we recognise that the historical injustices leading to the distribution of land today provide one of the deep motivations for our work, for our mission. So for those of you not fully acquainted with Prosper, I'll speak just for a moment on who we are, where we came from, and what we seek to achieve. Originally, we were the Henry George League of Victoria, established in the wake of Henry George's visit to Australia in the late 19th century. For a time, we were known as Tax Reform Australia, because who can object to tax reform? And we have finally rebranded as Prosper. And again, if you can find someone who objects to prosperity, out of the room. Henry George, the inspiration for our organisation, was a printer by trade. He was a writer by passion, and in modern, rather sterile terms, we would also describe him as both an economic scientist and a policy advocate. So as an economist, he brought to a broad audience the understanding of land rent and land taxation developed by Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and others, while also situating these ideas within a grand theory of inequality and its relation to technological progress. A theory that, so long as landholders profit from our collective need to access land, there can be forever both progress and poverty in society. That is, when the inherent monopoly in land absorbs the social surplus via competition for access, it leaves us no guarantee that economic growth will improve life for the poorest. So to hack up a fairly tired cliche of economic growth, a rising tide may in fact simply lift all rents. And this was Henry George's economics in a nutshell. He was also a policy advocate. His vision of economic justice today, for many of us who take our social institutions for granted, seems quite puzzling. It's a puzzling vision. It's a vision that citizens should be entitled not only to the full product of their own work effort and their disciplined savings and the entrepreneurial risks they take, but also to an equal share in the value of our common resources, the things which none of us produced, most particularly land. So George, like many before him and after him, saw no merit in the institution of privatised land rents. Private ownership of land, yes. Private control, yes. Private ownership of rent, no. So this Georgist policy ethic seems inarguable. It's a principled vision. The only weakness, the only claim against it is practicality, specifically the justice and the politics and the specific means of transitioning from here, our current system, to there, the ideal. Georgists are always called a bunch of dreamers, and yeah, we'll own that. It's, in a sense, a utopian vision. And this, in a nutshell, creates the role for Prosper. We want to make the ethical practical. And so we do research, we develop policy ideas, we engage. Emily dips into the acid bath of Twitter from time to time, and we cheerlead any change by any party that moves us closer to that better, fairer, and more prosperous world. A world where your effort, not your parents, determine your lot in life. And we are getting there. Our reports are being read in government, we hear. We see our fingerprints on policy change, and our language, the language of land monopoly, of speculation, rents, productive and unproductive activity, earned and unearned incomes, windfall gains, beneficiary pays, taxation. This is becoming the language of much policy debate. So for 132 years, we have gathered over dinner to hear from Australia's finest minds and some from elsewhere on how we can bring this better world, this vision of economic justice about. Tonight we have Emeritus Professor Ross Garnaut shortly arriving. And with Professor Garnaut, we will be hearing from one of the most insightful thinkers in Australian economic policy on how Australia is Henry George country, a country made for a tax, or perhaps taxes, on economic rent. We'll also be presenting, for the 10th time, our Writing Award, the EJ Craigie Award for George's writing. So I'll wrap up now and leave you to your dinner. You've got your entree. We'll interrupt you again shortly for the EJ Craigie Writing Award. The main course will be served, and after that we'll welcome Professor Garnaut to speak. Professor Garnaut has suffered an accident today. He's fallen off his bike. I understand he's broken his knee, so there's some great level of commitment to be here tonight. I don't know what else to say about that. I'm confident also that Professor Garnaut, even in his sort of damaged state, will find no more receptive an audience for proposals to tax economic rent than this audience, and I'm less confident he will avoid challenging questions about the relative priority of tackling corporate rents vis-a-vis residential land rents, but also go easy. The guy fell off his bike and he's here. So we all look forward to the speech. So in the meantime, please just enjoy the food and company. As I mentioned, there's a toilet behind me here, and there are men's downstairs in that direction, and a woman's over there. You'll also find drinks available downstairs at bar prices, you will have noted, and this is for efficiency and equity. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to shortly present the 10th EJ Craigie Award for George's writing, but before that, I want to define Stoicism. And Stoicism is responding to the question, how are you doing? With the answer, very well in the circumstances. So there is Stoicism, and a definite, I agree. Okay, Edward John Craigie was the member for Flinders in the Parliament of South Australia between 1930 and 1941, and was also a staunch advocate for the ideas of Henry George. Clyde Cameron, a minister in the Whitlam government, said of Craigie that this small, bespectacled man was always looked upon as the greatest debater the South Australian Parliament had ever seen. Indeed, Cameron went on to laud Craigie, to elevate him further in stature, by describing him as a great figure, the greatest man of this century, which was, of course, the 20th century at that point in time. Craigie held many important Georgist offices, including the presidency of the International Union for Land Value Taxation. Thus, to recognise the work of academics, journalists, researchers, media organisations and others beyond our own ranks and Prosper, in advocating for the principles of Henry George, Prosper in 2014 founded the annual EJ Craigie Award for the article or essay best contributing to contemporary Georgist thinking. Our past winners have included Jessica Irvine, Adam Creighton and Tim Sneesby, as well as a few Prosper-affiliated folk, including our President, Catherine Cashmore. Now, this year we are pleased to present the 10th award, sadly in absentia, to journalist and academic Waleed Aly for his recent piece in the Sydney Morning Herald entitled, "In Australia, why do people who produce nothing get rewarded the most?" Fine question, I thought. So Dr. Aly's article makes the case in quite plain and persuasive language for moving to tax settings that recognise the essential productive or unproductive character of the activity earning the income. So calls by economists to tax all sources of income equally are welcome, given how little we currently tax some incomes. But in a Georgist worldview, these calls are actually misguided. Why would we tax equally that which we want more of, productive activity, and that which contributes nothing valuable? Why not leave labour alone and tax rent to the utmost? And Waleed Aly agrees. I'll quote briefly from his piece. If we have to rethink our tax system, rent-seeking seems a good place to start. Perhaps if we taxed productive profit less than its unproductive counterpart, we would have the seedlings of a system better designed to meet what the intergenerational report warns us is coming. Of course, landlords are not typically considered rent seekers, but there's a case to be made that our tax system makes them so. Their tax concessions, such as on negative gearing and capital gains, are a kind of government subsidy maintained in part by a strong lobby group. That's not a criticism of landlords or property investors, against whom I have nothing, but it is a criticism of the incentives that make most of us wish we were part of their cohort. This column was particularly timely because in the last month, Prosper has launched a broad-ranging campaign for tax reform, which we call A Tax Shift for Our Future. And with this campaign, we are both outlining an agenda, a reform agenda, and also, crucially, articulating a language and the Georges framework for considering any tax proposal. So Dr. Aly evidently shares our worldview. He speaks in this article and he explains in simple terms the contrast between productive investment on the one hand and passive asset holding and unproductive rent seeking on the other. He is a deserving winner of this award, but unfortunately could not be here tonight. So we are directing the trophy, which it's under dispute whether it is a plinth or an obelisk, but it's made from wood. We are directing that to Waleed Aly upon his return from travel. And thank you all for your attention. I'll leave you alone now, for the main course will be arriving soon. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our speaker. Ross Garnaut is Emeritus Professor of Economics at both the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University. Professor Garnaut has written extensively on resource taxation, energy, climate change, global economic development, macroeconomic policy, and more. He is one of the world's leading minds on the role of rent in the economy and on policy approaches to capturing rent for public revenue. His book on the taxation of mineral rents with Anthony Clooney's Ross, published in 1983, remains one of the most influential texts on this subject. He's the author of many other books as well, including the best-selling Dog Days, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity, and Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession. Most recently, he has edited and contributed to a volume entitled The Superpower Transformation, Making Australia's Zero Carbon Future. He also held senior roles in government, serving as economic advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke and as Australian ambassador to China. He has been chairman or director of several companies, as well as chairman of the Australian Institute of International Agricultural Research, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and in recent times a director of the new Superpower Institute. Finally, he has led a number of influential reviews, including the 92 Review of Federal State Financial Relations and the 2008 Climate Change Review, as well as the 2011 Update. Now, if you'll excuse me a personal note, I recall very well 2 occasions of poring over papers written by Professor Garnaut. On each occasion, marvelling almost at the density of ideas in them and at the demonstration of just how high-quality analysis can restructure how we see our world, and being impressed at the mastery of ideas and language that that shows from the writing of true specialists. The first occasion was on digesting a 2002 paper, much later, a paper on horizontal fiscal equalisation, which sounds, I mean, come on, I'm allowed to geek out about HFE, all right? This is the principle under which we distribute the GST to the states, and you either appreciate this principle, Emily, and the purpose of this principle and the power of the GST formula, or you don't know anything about it. Yes. Ask John Brumby, Nick Garnaut. Everyone's a convert once you've had a good look at the CGC and HFE. So I worked on this topic intensively over a year or more for the 2012 GST distribution review, and Ross's paper was a touchstone as I explored this topic and came to respect this amazing, quite unique institution, or certainly most extreme version of this institution internationally, with this institution which moves money around quite deliberately by design to achieve efficiency and equity goals. It's more than it looks on the surface. The second paper I've returned to several times since it was released in 2018, and it outlines Ross's proposal for a cash flow tax. No doubt we will hear more. So we Georgists appreciate that land value taxation is an elegant solution, as Emily Sims of Prosper once put it to me, an elegant solution to capturing the rent of land without imposing economic cost. It is efficiency and equity without trade-off. So it is, if you like, elegance, beauty in policy design. And we Georgists also appreciate that land rents are not the only rent. Rent arises elsewhere in the economy. But until reading Ross's paper, I had no conception of the possibility that an equally elegant income tax design, corporate income tax design, could capture rent from other sources almost as cleanly as a land value tax does for land rents. So this was a huge insight. This was an insight that for me was almost as much a shift in perspective as when I first encountered the economics of land taxation. My final comment, I think there are three traits I see in Professor Garnaut's work that make him such a fitting speaker for us tonight. Three traits we should aspire to, and we will at Prosper. And before that, let us just take clarity of thought for granted. The first trait I see is the clarity of explanation. Professor Garnaut renders complex ideas, the most complex ideas imaginable, understandable to the attentive reader, and his words become the way you think, or at least it worked that way for me. And this for me is a true mastery of both ideas and language. The second trait is the way his analysis goes beyond economics, beyond economic science at least, beyond just simple explanation of cause and effect and the rest of this science, this social science, to direct the rational analysis and the creative insight, those processes, to direct those to policy design for public purpose. That is, to apply analytical powers to practical problems, not abstract ideas. And for me, the best analytical minds are wasted doing pure science. We need them for the practical problems of the world. So we're lucky to have an economic mind such as Professor Garnaut's, aimed squarely at useful policy proposals. The third, the most important trait, if you like, is the ambition quietly expressed in his work. There is always a welcome undercurrent of confidence, or at least optimism, that better, significantly better, in policy is possible. And this is an elevated perspective, one that lifts us up too, and one that encourages us to be as hopeful and ambitious about what we can collectively achieve. We Georgists suffer plenty from the charge of utopian thinking, which is, I think, unfair. Professor Garnaut's work embodies the idea that even if not utopia, at least progress is something we can always achieve. So, with that, please will you join me in welcoming our speaker for the 132nd Henry George Address, Professor Ross Garnaut. And keep clapping while I do the logistics.
Thanks, Tim, and very good to be here. Very good to be with this group of people. Very good to know that such a group still gathers 132 years after Henry George came to Sydney and Melbourne. Thanks, Emily, for all your care, and thanks to Max and his colleague who carried me up the stairs, or I might have been speaking from a position where I could see you even less well than sitting here. When Tim described me as a world expert on mineral tax, I wondered at that, but then I remembered there was a very big tax case between Esso and the American Internal Revenue Service. Lawyers amongst you can look at IRS versus Esso. To my great disappointment, it ended up being settled out of court for a few $1 billion when it could have been tens of billions. But the IRS employed me as their main expert witness, and it turned out that the case hanged on whether the British petroleum revenue tax was an income tax or a royalty. And there was about $30 billion of revenue hanging on this question. And both sides were referring to my book with Anthony Clunies-Ross, a wonderful Melbourneian who died 4 or 5 years ago. Were referring to it, and then the IRS rolled me out to actually define what we said. And the Esso had employed 10 silks. They don't call them state counsel, something else from New York. This case was in Washington, and 10 from Queen's counsels at the time. Queen Elizabeth, of course, was well and truly alive, but from London. And they were all lined up, and I was told I'd be there a week, one after another. They would cross-examine me. And then after about an hour of the first one's cross-examination, they asked for an adjournment. And they came back they had a huddle, and half an hour they came back and said, "We have no further questions of this witness, Your Honour." And I said to the people from the IRS, the lawyers from the IRS, "What happened?" You said, "I'd be here all week." He said, "They worked out that the longer you were there, the worse their chances." So I'll take your point about an international expert. I think I could have got them the 30 billion, but they settled for about 8 billion. It's remarkable that this society it has an annual dinner and this sort of talk 130 years after the great man visited Australia. We don't have a Parkes or a Reid or a Lyne lecture, although these three figures who were premiers of New South Wales right through the 1890s, through that period, were pretty important historical figures. Less surprising that we don't have a Munro, Shields, Patterson, Turner or Maclean lecture. The Victorian premiers at the time didn't make such marks. Henry George certainly left his mark. You might know Bede Nan's brief entry on George in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. It marks George down as a minor figure, and I don't think that's right. At the time, selling several million copies of a fairly hard economics book about economics, Poverty and Progress, several million copies, when the world population was 1/5 of what it is today, and where the literate proportion of the world population was 1/5 of the population it is today. So you've got to take that into account. He sold the equivalent of 75 million copies. My publisher was delighted when, after a year, we hit 20,000 with Superpower. And the main ideas in George, and I'm including all of his work, including protection and free trade, seem to me to be broadly right now as they were then. Now, and it's not just the single tax. For those I've been told that most members of the society would have at least got through progress and poverty. It's not just a single tax. He wanted free trade, and that's important for global development and very important for Australia's place in the world. He wanted to tax land and other rent as the main source of government revenue. Well, governments spend a lot more now than then. No government then thought about spending $369 billion on nuclear submarines. So probably the rent taxes can't do the whole lot now, whereas it was realistic to think of rent taxes doing a lot in the 1890s. Back then, in Australia, there was a lot of discussion of rent, and what people were most focused on was the land on the great agricultural and pastoral properties that had been taken up with very little payment, were in the process of conversion into freehold, often with little payment. And I think that made Australians more receptive than they otherwise might have been at the time. He also wanted to promote competition and break up monopolies whenever this was possible. And so he noted that some economic activities are natural monopolies. It's a natural monopoly to run a transmission or distribution line for electricity down the street. You wouldn't actually want competition with 10 different lines down your street. But where you have a natural monopoly, he wanted us to make sure that these weren't private monopolies, that they were in public ownership. Railways were the big ones in the monopolies in those days. And also, one that's very relevant to my work in the tail end of my career, this last 16 years mainly spent on climate change issues, he wanted a tax to balance the costs imposed by one firm on the general community. What, after Professor Pigo's work at Cambridge in the 20s, we called a Pigovian tax, taxing the damage that one person or firm does to others in the community. Taxing comprehensively just one such external cost, carbon emissions, would raise over $70 billion this year with today's European carbon price and exchange rate, and this year's expected Australian carbon volumes. Now, everyone's forgotten, but we had a very good carbon price for 2 years. It worked. I've done a lot of work on a whole lot of areas of public policy over a lot of years, and usually when you do a paper and government accepts what you're doing, it doesn't work out exactly as your modelling showed it would, and if it's near enough, people forgive you. But actually, the carbon pricing modelling worked out exactly as we said. The emissions fell by 8% per annum for a couple of years. And a really big tragedy, well, the whole thing's a tragedy, and all the mess we're in now, let's think of that as an Abbott tax. But back then, we'd negotiated arrangements, the Minister for Climate Change, Greg Combay had negotiated arrangements for us to become part of the European Union trading scheme. And then from the 1st of July 2014, we would have been part of the European scheme. Well, Abbott got rid of carbon pricing the day before that, on the 30th of June 2014. If we had that, government would be collecting over $70 billion a year. Now, that's not a tiny bit of money. We could pay for the nuclear submarines if we wanted to, still want to have them. Take 5 or 6 years of the carbon price. Or 1 year would pay for Medicare for 2.5 years. That'd be pretty good. And although tax rates have risen and risen and risen on personal income, we could cut every personal tax rate by 30%, from the highest to the lowest, out of that 70 billion. Some members of the coalition love the idea of a higher GST to pay for income tax. Well, they could have it as a a carbon price to pay for income tax, and that would be a Pagovian or a Georgian tax of externalities. That 70 billion hopefully won't be with us forever. We want to have zero emissions by well, the government says 2050. I gave a talk to the Melbourne Energy Institute today and said we'd be richer if we got there by 2035. So that's a temporary tax, big one, gradually phasing down, but that could pay for an awful lot of tax reform. And you do have to pay for tax reform in our political system. People have forgotten when John Howard introduced the GST, he spent on the tax cuts and the other things that were part of the package more than 1% of GDP than he collected in the GST. So in today's dollars, more than $25 billion more he handed out as to make it more politically acceptable. Well, if you had, and that was a continuing 25 billion a year, because it took the form of income tax cuts and various other things that were permanently baked into the system. So we could pay for a fair bit of tax reform, and the really hard bit is the transition. By the time we ran out of carbon tax in 2035 or 2050, because we didn't have any carbon emissions anymore, then we'd have the new systems working. They'd be much more efficient, and we'd have much more productive economy paying for itself in other ways. Back in '86, Kim Anderson and I published a book on Australian protection. It was basically finished at the beginning of '83. Kim and I were both at the ANU, but Bob Hawke asked me to be his economic advisor, and so I apologised to Kim that I didn't have that much time, and so it took us to '86 to finish the last little bit of the book. But in that book we noted Georgia's influence in what we saw as the attractive policies of the New South Wales free trade governments supported by Labor in the 1890s. That's a really interesting period for Georgians, but I think for Australians in Australian public policy. It was the young Labor Party, very strongly committed to redistribution. And the deal by which the succession of free trade premiers, the most important of which was Reid, the deal they did was that they'd charge a lot more for the big land rents and use that to pay for first free trade, because free trade costs money. You're not getting import duties. And Australia's first old age pensions and some other social security payments. That was, at the same time, Victoria was heading in another direction, protection, and leaving the rents more or less in place. That was a battle between Reid and Deakin once. Deakin was never Premier in the 90s, but he was 3 times Prime Minister. A battle between him and Reid in the first 8 years of Federation, and lots of ways Deakin a more attractive human. But on some of the fundamental policies, Reid had a fair bit going for him. But because Deakin was a more attractive human, he won, and for the next several generations, Australia became more and more protectionist. So there's not much doubt in my mind about Georgian influence in New South Wales in the 1890s. Very important, very direct. But if you do doubt it, there's absolutely no doubt at all about Georgia's influence through Marion and Walter Griffin on the financial model applied to Canberra from its commencement of Canberra in 1927. Burley Griffin was a friend and fan of Henry George. He must have been a very gregarious and attractive figure. He became a close friend also of Archbishop Manock, so he became an opponent of conscription as well. But Canberra had in place for several decades a system where there was no private freehold land, and people had long leases and paid an economic rent which was adjusted every 10 years. The seat had always been Labor, But when the long-standing Labor member Jim Fraser retired, John Gorton thought this was a chance to win one seat, so he gave that away. Didn't win the seat, and now it's only the Teals and Greens and Labor that win any seats anyway. So I hope that John Gorton, if his ghost is still around, thinks that was an awful waste. Free trade became anathema or curiosity or joke to most Australians in the generations that followed Federation, as well as the George books. I hope you've read Hancock, who had an origin here and spent most of his life at Oxford before coming back to the Australian National University in its early days. But Hancock's marvellous book, Australia, but he's got a chapter talking about Australia's love of protection, even the word protection with all of its friendly connotations. But this cost us a lot of money. It made us a lot poorer, especially it made ordinary Australians a lot poorer. The arrangement, the intellectual basis of Australian protection was worked out in the 1920s by a few economists from Tasmania, very good minds, Brigden, Copeland, who came to Tasmania from New Zealand, and the most remarkable of all, Giblin. Giblin, a remarkable economist, he ended up being the first Ritchie Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne. But before he became Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne, he did a brilliant degree at Cambridge. While at Cambridge, he grew up on Australian football in Tasmania, but he captained England, not Cambridge, England's rugby team in international games while he was at Cambridge. That was before the First World War. He was injured between Cambridge and the war, he was a gold digger in the Yukon and didn't have any luck. So had to get back to having a job, but then the war broke out and injured 3 times, quite seriously, then became statistician for Tasmania. So these economists wrote a report that established the Australian case for protection, and the idea was that protection in a country like Australia, whose main exports were depended on land, that generated very high rents of land. So what protection did was effectively put an indirect tax on land, and by the protection also created demand for labour. New industries were established, and that either put upward pressure on wages or allowed more immigration from countries and we only took people from the British Isles at that time in our history, and they had not as high wages as Australia, but reasonably high. So the Australian case for protection was an indirect tax on rent, and it paid for employment in these ways. And the logic's all right as far as it goes, but it misses the point that if you taxed that rent directly and used it directly to support labour in one form or another, you could either get many more benefits for labour, or you could take less of the squatters' rents. Giblin certainly would have preferred to do more for labour, but they didn't look at that. They just went straight for protection. And the reason was that Australia's love of protection, which Hancock had talked about. Well, this was very costly for Australia. On the eve of the First World War, we were the richest country in the world on a per capita basis, by quite a margin. Our wages were the highest in the world, very attractive country. People in other countries wrote books about Australia as the working man's paradise. We had very poor economic performance as protection rose between the wars. We lost our position. America became much richer. We slid down the table, and that kept on going after the war. gradually economists and others began to notice the costs of protection. There was a better way of doing things, and nothing was done about it really. Whitlam had a shot but with the 25% tariff cut, but the political context of that didn't work, and Fraser in effect reversed all that with a lot of other protectionist measures. But Hawke set us on a path to be a very open economy, more or less free trade, and did a version of what they did in the 1890s, much bigger. But we got Medicare, or Whitlam had introduced Medicare, but Fraser had abolished it. Well, Medicare came back, much wider system of social security, including the payments for kids that we still have today, survived the last couple of decades. There was very heavy investment in education. The proportion of kids finishing high school more than doubled over a decade. So we had a much more efficient economy. Through the 1890s, our productivity growth, for the first time in Australia's history since Federation, was the highest in the developed world, and that came out as sustainable increases in wages. And we had this social security context, introduction of superannuation of people other than an executive elite. But free trade was delivering. We lost a lot of the social policies that were part of that package in the 80s and 90s with succession of conservative governments, and perhaps partly for that reason, but more, I think, the role of vested interests in our policy-making process. We got tired of open trade, and we've been drifting back to protection in recent years, and we got a big boost to our productivity and our incomes and living standards by opening up. Don't be surprised if we go backwards when we go backwards on trade policy. I don't cite Milton Friedman on everything, but he's correct on free trade. And the most correct thing he ever said on free trade was a quotation from Henry George's Protection or Free Trade. I think that's worth repeating. This is Friedman citing George. It's a very interesting thing, said Friedman, paraphrasing George. It's a very interesting thing that in times of war, think of Russia and the Ukraine, in times of war, we blockade our enemies in order to prevent them getting goods from us. In times of peace, we do it to ourselves by tariffs, which we do to our enemies in times of war. Kim Anderson and I discussed the famous Australian case for protection in that book 4 decades ago, and it became quite a cause célèbre, that Australian case for protection, a bit against the conventional wisdom, appeared in American journals. Marion Crawford Samuelson, an eminent economist herself, but remembered mainly as the wife of Paul, just as the fantastic architect Marion Griffin is remembered mainly as the partner of Walter Burley Griffin. But Marion wrote an article that actually put the Australian case in a more logical form. And then her brilliant husband, Paul Samuelson, probably the most famous economist in America in those decades, certainly his textbooks sold the most copies. Samuelson then elegantly turned it into a neoclassical model in which you could show that in a country that had an abundance of capital and land and, well, capital and a shortage of labour, then protection could shift the distribution of income towards labour. But it was a huge oversimplification of what had been a sophisticated Australian case. There was no land in it. And the core of the Australian case for protection was the indirect tax on land that came from protection. And the elegance of Samuelson, and he freely admitted that he had to do that, had to get rid of land because the algebra didn't work if you had this messy fixed factor of production. So we went backwards there, but Samuelson was a colleague at at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology of a chap who was a brilliant young fellow at the time, Bob Solow. Solow was working on a theory of economic based on the Samuelson type of model, where you have no land and free movement of capital and labour, automatic adjustment, so that you always had full employment. It was a very interesting growth model. Trevor Swan at the Australian National University, who'd come out of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, Coombs and Crawford's old department, working then they were to Curtin and Chifley, and then later Menzies kept them all on in various ways, so there was a good period of continuity. But Trevor Swan was working on growth models, and these were the two leading theorists of the world at the time, late 50s, early 60s, on growth models. And Swan tried to keep land in his model to make it more realistic, and he was worried about the rising rents of land and what that would do to income distribution and what it would do to the growth process unless you did something about it. Solow's model, and the algebra is extremely difficult, in fact impossible if you've got fixed factors of production. Solow didn't worry about that, had a much more elegant model, and he won the Nobel Prize for economic science. Those of us who were around as students at the ANU thought that wasn't very clever of the Nobel Secretariat, but still. But that set us on a wrong course. Models of economic growth that couldn't have any rent. The basic assumptions precluded any rent. And I always thought this was a very big problem. And so I was delighted visiting my close friend, colleague, and mentor, Max Corden, about half a dozen years ago, 2017. And Max showed me a letter he just got from Bob Solow. At the time, 2017, Max would have been 88 and Bob Solow was a few years older. So Bob was in his 90s, and Max showed me the letter, and a few years ago he gave me permission to use it. Solow said in the letter, written 6 decades after that work that got him the Nobel Prize, he said to Max, "We conventionally allocate all of the value added to either compensation of labour or return to capital, to debt and capital as debt and equity. That would be fine," Bob Solow wrote, "if there were perfect competition. In reality, there is a third component, monopoly rent. It gets allocated to labour and capital in unknown proportions. What one would like to see is a three-way breakdown in market return to labour, market return to capital, and rent." Well, Bob saw the point 60 years later. Well, the changing role of rent, very appropriate of George in the 19th century to focus on land rents and urban rents in the United States, rapidly growing population that was raising the value of land rents. It's said that one of the things that got him into the field, that opened up his eyes, was moving from New York to California and finding that although the land was much richer in California, it was much more expensive in New York, and population and local demand for product had made land much more expensive. And he could foresee that Californian land would eventually be expensive like New York land, and so he started to think about how you could tax that for the community rather than giving windfall benefits to individuals. And he was talking about agricultural land rents, but also urban land rents. But other times of history, other rents have been very important. In Piketty's book, Capital, he's done marvellous statistical work using the official records going back to before the French Revolution for France, all the state and federal documents for the United States and other countries. And in the couple of decades before the Civil War, half of the value of capital in the southern states of the United States was the capital value of the slaves. At the time, agricultural land and urban land, yes, they generated rent, but the rent of slaves was the big one. I don't know if they today would think worth losing 300,000 people over, but they fought pretty hard to keep it. So different times of history, different sources of rent become important. So, and they've become especially important, much more important than in the 20th century and the 21st century so far. We're seeing this everywhere in the world, but we're seeing it much more in Australia than elsewhere. And it's reflected in a number of ways. One is the rising profit share of national income. I didn't know what time I started.
You should continue as long as you wish.
Right,
We've got all night.
The increased profit share. Now, this is remarkable when you think about it. In that old solo model, if capital became very cheap, then without any change in technology in that model where labour and capital move smoothly from one thing to another, the economists in the group will know what I'm talking about anyway, and sorry if others don't. But in that sort of world, if that's accurately describing your world, then as capital becomes cheaper, you get a movement towards more labour-saving technology, which makes it easier to pay higher wages, and that's a helpful process. 92 years ago, John Maynard Keynes, the greatest public intellectual, I think, in the world in the 20th century, wrote a lovely essay that was published in his collection, Essays in Persuasion. It's called The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, and remember 31, the rise of fascism in Europe, a lot of attraction of fascism in Britain, division in society, unemployment at 30%. And he said to his students at Cambridge in this essay, there's no need for all this unemployment and there's no need for war, so let's try and avoid those things in future. But if we don't have them to muck it up, then in 100 years capital will be, and he went through the arithmetic, accumulation of capital will be abundant, and there won't be as much new stuff to spend it on, and so capital will be cheap, and that will make labour dear and scarce. And in that world, no one will have a high income. They'll have wealth, but they won't have a high income simply because they own capital. The real rate of return on investment will be around zero. Now, what has happened to the rate of return on investment, the real cost of capital, in the 21st century is pretty well gone to where Keynes said it would go. The average interest rate on long debt for riskless investment, lending to the government, is on average has been, in most developed countries, has been lower than the inflation rate since the very low inflation rate. The real cost of long-term debt has been negative or zero, and in countries where it's not negative or zero, it's slightly positive. Australia too. So in Solo's model, without any rent, this abundance of capital, very cheap capital, should have led to returns on investment being much lower, the labour share rising. But exactly the opposite's happened. The last decade, we've seen a historic increase in the profit share and the fall of the wage share of national income. Well, never seen anything like it in our history. It had already gone a long way in the first decade of the century, but a lot further in the second decade. Well, the only explanation and good economists understand this, for such a divergence between the rate of return on competitive riskless capital and actual business rates of return reflected in the profit share of GDP is a rise in the role of rent. And it's huge. Well, where's it come from? There's now beginning to be a fairly good literature on this, best in the United States, partly because you've got a more diverse economics profession there than here, and partly because they've got better data, but the work is going on now, really laying out how important that increase in rent has been, the increase in the rent share of income, accounting for that divergence between the profit share of national income and the real cost of capital. Now, the actual increase in the profit share and the fall in the wage share is actually bigger than the statistician makes it look. When Joyce got paid a termination payment of $26 million last week, that goes into the wage share. And there's been an explosion of remuneration for senior executives this century. First in business, and that 26 million for Joyce, anything like that would have happened in the 20th century. Not a 20th of that in real terms, and it's gone right across business, much further in Australia than in Europe or Japan. It's gone as far in Australia as in the United States, although in the United States they're running much bigger businesses than people in those same jobs here. So it's not a small thing. But we're counting that as wages, part of the wages share, and this big shift from wages to profits goes on despite that. It's happening everywhere, but biggest in Australia. So why is it so big in Australia? Well, there's actually quite a number of reasons. One is the huge growth in the role of minerals and mineral rent in the economy. We had a treasure with pretty crude use of language when I was working for the Prime Minister, and when we first started talking about this sort of thing, the rise of China and what that would do to our export opportunities, he said, "Mate, we're going to be hit in the arse by a rainbow." The rainbow came in the early 21st century. From 2002 until 2012, the most populous country on earth, India's just overtaken them, but then they were significantly the most populous country on earth, grew faster, averaging 10% per annum in real output, than any country ever had, for a longer period than any country had ever grown fast before, for a decade. And this pattern of their growth was just highly complementary to our resources. They needed the iron ore, the energy, the fossil energy as it was in those days, wide range of other foodstuffs, wool. You didn't mention, Tim, I did a report on the wool industry back in '93, and I actually even talked about this a little bit, but China then took 5% of the Australian wool clip. It now takes about 80% of the Australian wool clip, and most of it goes onto the backs of Chinese. So there was a huge increase in demand for Australian exports, and there was a big shift in the profitability, in prices and profitability of Australian export industries, exports of commodities, but especially the minerals. On average and in real terms, the price of iron ore the last half dozen years had a bit of a dip in COVID, but take the average in real terms, it's about 4 times as high as it was in the 1990s. Well, BHP and Rio Tinto were making good profits from their mines when the price of iron ore was $20 a tonne. And then it rose to $200 a tonne. That was pretty good profits too. Iron ore went further than others, but the permanent, after all the fluctuations, the permanent increase in energy prices, well, they more than doubled in real terms after taking into account inflation. Wide range of other products behaved similarly. So this was a huge increase in rent, certainly for anyone who hadn't established export business. And the big ones were well established by the time this started to happen. They didn't work. I think I did all the work talking, as ambassador, talking the Chinese into the advantages of using high quality Australian ore rather than their own rubbish in their steel industry. But the rents went to the companies that actually owned the mineral deposits. And the share of already in the 90s, we've begun to see some of these effects of rising demand for minerals in China and other Northeast Asian countries. I wrote that story back in '89, actually, in my report to the government, Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy. But by the end of the century, 5% of Australian GDP was minerals. Well, since then it's increased to 15%, and then minerals were about a quarter of Australian exports. We went through a period towards the end of last century when manufactured exports, services, minerals, and agricultural products were similar value. Well, now minerals is 3 times the value of all the others put together, and that's reflected in 15% of income. And so that has greatly increased Australian national income. We don't tax that much. The increase in annual exports, value of exports, is several $100 billion per annum. We apply the corporate income tax to them at 30%. West Australia applies 7% to the royalty to the iron ore. Ken Henry had a shot at doing something about that. Did a very good report. I think it was a bit boffinish. He came up with an approach to rent that was theoretically elegant, but no one understood it. And he hadn't talked to me beforehand. And then after it ran into trouble with a great big raspberry from the press and the media industry, I got a call from Treasury saying, "What do we do now?" And I said, "Go over to the National Library and get out my book on mineral rent," which they didn't think was very helpful because they needed something immediately. But it's a great tragedy, really. Henry reports mineral tax wasn't the right tax, but if we'd done it, we'd be getting more than $100 billion a year in revenue from the mining industry, and we could have even bigger submarines. It would have been transformative. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, and there was a little bit of a feeling that we'd missed our chance. But if we'd done it in 2015 or 2018, then there still would have been a big opportunity. The one problem of those 2 episodes in 2013, the victory of Abbott on the negative campaign of getting rid of the mineral tax, getting rid of the carbon tax, one problem of that is it gave big business the idea that they've got a veto over policies that they don't like. They invested what seemed a lot in the political process. They gave the Mining Industry Council gave $10 million for a campaign to attack the Rudd government, and they got rid of Kevin, and then Julia made as Minister for Energy and in charge of negotiating all these things, minerals and energy, a chap who resigned from the Parliament 3 days later and became the main 3 weeks later or 3 months later and became the main lobbyist of the petroleum industry, Martin Ferguson. So it's a pretty miserable and depressing episode, but it need not be that bad. I remember I used to have, when I was in Sydney, I used to call round on Bob Hawke and we'd talk about what was going on in the world. And I was whinging a bit about the government of the day not doing this or not doing that. And he said, "Stop whinging, Ross. You were just spoiled." And I was. But there are other great leaders, some of them in the Parliament. And we've got to work to give them the platform that they can stand on and transform Australia for the better when they get a chance. Well, that's the mineral side of things. I'll just very quickly mention some of the others. The land rents, the urban land rents, big story. If you looked at all the things that have changed since Jane and I were young, one of the awful ones in Australia is then you'd get your first job and you'd be able to buy a house, and 20 years later you'd have paid it off without a big effort. Well, kids today can't unless they get help from mum and dad, rich relatives. That's a tragedy. And I don't think the discussion of why land prices are so high, this is a different question from taxing the rent, but I don't think it's been properly discussed. The value of land in a good urban location is the difference between the cost of the land on the frontiers, 30 kilometres out on the paddy fields halfway to Ballarat, and the value of the land in a good location. And that differential, which sets the value of land in the attractive areas, is very much affected by the quality of transport and communications. And we haven't invested in line with the growth of our population. Sure, let's make sure we tax this huge increase in values, land values that we've had, but let's also recognise there are ways that we could have managed things and can that reduce the disadvantages of living out on the edge, and therefore reduce the value of being in the centre, which puts up so many prices. Immigration, I think, got too high. Well, the character of it changed over this period too. The 21st century became mainly unskilled immigration, competing with low-income Australians. I'm all in favour of immigration. You look at my life and career, but I think it got out of hand and has just overwhelmed urban capacity, and is part of the reason for the extraordinary shortage of housing and increases in land values and rents. So let's tax the rents. We can use part of that money to increase the supply of housing, as the Victorian government wanted to do until the development industry jumped on it a few years ago. But let's also think a bit more strategically about what's causing the extremely high, large increases in land prices. No other country has immigration like Australia has as a proportion of the population.
New Zealand.
As a proportion, yes.
Yeah, faster than Australia.
Okay.
5 or 6 years.
Well, you've probably got pretty high values of land too. I didn't do my research on New Zealand, sorry.
We get used to it.
Yeah. So I think there are two very big reasons why Australia's done worse than other developed countries, but and also just standard monopoly and oligopoly is more serious here than elsewhere. The Qantas story that's become news is an important part of that, a small part, but an important part, banking. 4 big banks all putting up their interest rates or putting them down on the same day by the same amount. No competition. They all know they can signal to each other. They all know how to work together. Mea culpa, I worked with Hawke and Keating on the liberalisation of the financial system, and that was meant to increase competition. And it did for a little while, but remember all of those, well, only old people will remember all of those credit unions we used to have, and housing, what were they called? Housing societies? Building societies. And the state banks. We had much more competition, much more oligopolised banking sector now. And look at right through the Australian economy, we see that. Australians were really in denial about this. Very good book by Philippon from an American academic, just come out, discussing this problem, how much worse America is today than a generation ago on competitiveness. Comparing US with Europe, Europe's done much better. They've had much stronger antitrust provisions, forcing divestment where concentration is becoming too great. They've actually, he concludes that one of the reasons for that is they turned 20 countries into one, and so you didn't have the well-organised lobbies in each country knocking it all on the head. But America's much worse than Europe. We are much worse than America. And in America, there's been a serious discussion the last half dozen years of the problem. Now, it still hasn't captured the political discussion, but there's a real, mainly academic, but a real a bit of analysis going on. Well, we haven't much had that in Australia. A few lonely people in the Henry George Society and who are trying to keep it alive, but it hasn't really been seen as a serious issue. Well, I think this year it is again. Well, the ACCC asked me to give the Bannerman lecture in which I highlighted these issues. Emily, maybe that's why you asked me to talk here tonight. And 2 splendid speeches in the last month, one by Andrew Leigh. He gave a talk at the Conference of Economists. It's well worth reading. It would be on his website if it's not on the Economic Society's. Just going through the extent of the problem, I'm pointing out, as people in America are doing, that this monopolisation has done 2 things. It's increased directly the profit margins, but it's also created a monopsony for employment and labour, forcing down wage rates. And those 2 things are happening at the same time. Well, we haven't faced up to this, but Andrew Leigh's paper starts to raise the issue in a sophisticated way. And also Rod Sims, the former chair of the ACCC, gave a speech a few days ago. I don't actually remember where it was. He just sent it to me and I read it. But going through some of the awful detail of the increased monopoly in Australia. So that's another problem of Australia that we've got to come to grips with. The good news, we're starting to think about it, and the Treasurer has just introduced a review of competition policy, almost certainly inspired by Andrew Leigh. For these reasons, now is the time to become more focused on the reform issue. There's more at stake than there ever was before. Add them all up. The tax on carbon externalities, the tax on housing rent, tax on business monopolies, and the increased competition like the Treasurer and Andrew Leigh want to do and Rod Sims wants to do. That's great, but it won't solve the whole problem, and that's why I'd like members of the Society to think about our cash flow tax. The authors of it, an article in the Australian Economic Review in December 2020, buried a little bit by health events around the time. But my co-authors, Craig Emerson, who had been Minister for Trade in the Gillard government and Rudd government and had been my PhD student earlier on, and Reuben Finnegan, a brilliant young Victorian who just completed a PhD on these sorts of issues at London School of Economics. LSE broke its normal rules and allowed me to be a supervisor of that, and my age is not responsible to take on new students, so that'll be the last, but a tremendous mind. And Stephen Anthony, who at the time was chief economist for the super funds, and the essence of this, we think that we can design a simple corporate, well, it's a tax on business income. We talked about the corporate tax, but actually it could be a tax on all business income, whether it's in companies or other entities. So we'd allow immediate deduction of any capital expenditure. We'd give a tax credit for negative cash flows at the corporate tax rate. We would not allow any deductions for interest or any other payments for financing, and we would deny a deduction for imports of services, unless those imports of services related directly to provision of the service within Australia. We think those four things together define a tax on economic rent. It would mean that on average, firms in competitive businesses, like the marvellous restaurants of Melbourne, who fight each other to death and half of them die every year, on average they wouldn't pay any tax. Those who are actually making losses would get a bit of a payment, and those who are making profits would pay a bit at the tax rate. But and other competitive businesses, small businesses are generally competitive. On average they wouldn't pay tax. And companies that are innovating would find this tax system very much more congenial, because the current tax system systematically discriminates against the company that takes a risk, because there's a chance it will fail and you don't get a credit for your tax losses if the company fails, whereas if you're successful, you pay tax. And that's very different from the company that's earning rents. They just sit on their laurels, earn big money year after year, think Rio Tinto or Qantas or Westpac. And if they do want to make some investment, they know they're going to get a deduction for the negative cash flow, but the innovator that's not sitting on all those rents doesn't get that deduction. So it's good for innovation. It's also good for the firm that's expanding and investing, and those who are sitting on rents and not investing and innovating. That's most of the Australian economy. Most of those profits, they'll pay a lot more. We calculated that at a 30% tax rate and doing these things, it would be roughly revenue neutral. And we didn't say this in the paper, but I'll tell you a secret. There's no need for it to be revenue neutral if the tax takes this form, because there's no way it can be avoided if you're making rents in Australia, you don't get out. You want to stay here and keep earning them, and there's and this is a very good system for avoiding international avoidance of tax. So we think now's the time for that. You could have an extra layer of it. For those industries are earning lots of rents, mining, land development. Maybe for these you'd give them a credit if a state government is a credit for payments to the state government, so that you're not double taxing them. In fact, that's something I would do. If the Queensland government did something marvellous during this period of very high coal prices, it whacked a 40% extra royalty on coal industries, and BHP said they would never invest in the state again. Queensland government's just committed $13 billion for a pumped hydro plant and a whole lot of new transmission to support the energy transition, and it's got the biggest budget surplus in Australian history. And it's made payments for consumers of electricity so their bills don't go up too much, and increase the range of state health services. Still got the biggest budget surplus in Australian history, and And I loved Anastasia Palaszczuk's response and the Treasurer's response. Anastasia said, "Oh, well, that's a pity, but there's lots of other companies that want to invest in Queensland." And the Treasurer said they'd be very welcome to go if that's what they wanted to do. So, things might be turning a little bit. People who've been thinking about these problems for a long time, let's help them turn.
Thank you, Ross. That was fabulous. It was the speech for economists, and at least this one appreciated every moment. One minor gripe is that I introduced you as an optimist, and we ran through the corruption and the erasure of language of rent because it didn't work for the algebra, the growing share of rent in the economy at the expense of wages. What else how to derail a mining tax, all the reasons that we have failed to expand our urban area with transport investment, and growing monopolisation of the economy. So I'm going to retract my optimist comment, I'm sorry. We've got time for a few questions. I get the first one because I've got the mic, and I'll come back to this question of language because if you can't name it, you can't describe it, and others can't see it. And language is so important for the worldview and the sense of possibility that people take. You mentioned Paul Samuelson, who has this famous quote where he says, this is the 20th century economist, Paul Samuelson says, "I don't care who writes the laws of the country as long as I write the textbooks." And it's a beautiful quote, and in essence, maybe what Prosper would like is we don't mind who's in power if we write the dictionary, perhaps. Because when language of rent, supernormal profits, has disappeared from everyday discourse, we are unable to articulate the reasons for the policies we want. You, in 2020, during the COVID recession, made a pitch for large-scale reform, and I recall a comment you made was that we need to bring people along. A precondition for this reform is the Australian population sensing there is an equity in the reform and a purpose in terms of prosperity, but sensing that things will be fair. Thinking about this, I worry that our language, even of fairness, has been debased so that we all now understand fairness as rich and poor, vertical equity, winners and losers, and we at Prosper we don't have a position. We are essentially bipartisan. We don't have a position on the vertical equity of income distribution. We have a position on where you get your income, the source, not the amount. Our Georgist ethic is about the process of deriving income rather than the amount you derive. I wonder, is it possible, do you think we are collectively capable of changing this type of language to understand fairness in taxation in a new way that is not currently visible to the population?
Yes, I do, and mainly because both my reading of history and my experience in an unconscionably long professional life tell me that things can change, and change when you're not expecting it. Kim Anderson and I, this is a little bit embarrassing, we basically finished the work on that book on Australian protection in early '83, and then Hawke said, come and work with me, and so we're another 3 years before it was published. It's basically pessimistic about getting rid of Australian protection. And by the time it came out, we were well on the way Hawke's the source of a lot of those political economy bits of wisdom, but when he called me over from the ANU the day after the election and said, "Will you take on this job?" And he said, "Are there any things in our platform that would make that difficult for you?" And he said, "Before you answer that, I know there's a lot of protection in the platform, but that's not going to be a worry. I want you to work for me partly because I want to get rid of that. But he said, we won't be doing it on the first day. He said, the first job will be you helping me to explain why it has to be done, so that when we start doing it, it won't be a surprise to anyone. No, not everyone will agree to it, but they won't be surprised, and they'll know that there's a rationale for it. And that's how he went about all of the big reforms. There have been two big periods in Australia when we did things that at the beginning you wouldn't have expected. The other one is post-war reconstruction. I've already touched on, but Australia had a miserable time between the wars, apart from so many of our young men being dead or maimed. And that affected everything in society between those wars. But average unemployment in the 20s was 10%, very high, and in the 30s, 30%. And the general expectation was we'd go back to that after the war. And Curtin and Chifley said, well, we can't ask Australians in this new war to make great sacrifices and expect them to go back to what we had before the war. So they set up the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, and they put together some brilliant, well, today, at my 77 years of age, I'd call them kids. Nugget Coombs, Jack Crawford, Roland Wilson, Trevor Swan, and gave them the job. They said, give us a paper on how we can have full employment after the war, and a proper social security system. And for a lot of reasons, we've got to have a lot of immigration, so we want rising wages alongside a much bigger immigration program. And at the time when they first started talking about these ideas, they came under huge attack from the then political opposition. But after a few years of talking about what needed to be done and then starting to do it, by the time Menzies became Prime Minister, he just wanted to keep it going. He knew that politically the smart thing was to keep it going because the Australian community had bought the new program. A lot of really hard things. First, the idea that government would basically control the money supply. Back in 1931, at the depth of the Depression, those Tasmanian economists, Giblin and others, had a really good plan for getting Australia out of the Great Depression. It required a big devaluation of the currency, amongst other things, and the government to have a lot of debt-funded public works. Things that today just seem to be the natural things that you do in that sort of situation. But the government owned the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth Bank was the government's banker, and Gibson, the governor of the Commonwealth Bank, said, "No way, we're not lending you any of that money, and we'll stop you devaluing the currency." Theodore, brilliant treasurer, had been Premier of Queensland, a correspondent of John Maynard Keynes at Cambridge at the time. He'd bought the Australian economist's idea, and he persuaded a very nice man, wonderful man, Jim Scullin, from this town, that they had to get rid of Gibson. And so Scullin called him into the office, and when Gibson went out, he said, I've been given another 7-year term. So we had a much nastier Great Depression than we needed to have. There was strong opposition to these new ideas. But through the public education, serious work on policy, so that people could see how it all fitted together, it started to work. And so that when Menzies became Prime Minister, Coombs had been very close to Chifley and much criticised by the opposition at the time as being a Labor person. Coombs at the time had been made, after post-war reconstruction, and became governor of the Commonwealth Bank. Chifley wasn't going to have the same thing happen to him as happened to Scullin. And Coombs was Chancellor of the ANU when I was a student. He gave me my PhD degree. Crawford, from that same Department of Post-War Reconstruction, no, Coombs gave me my first degree, Crawford gave me my PhD degree. So I used to talk to them about these things. And Coombs said, I got this call to come up from Sydney, from the Commonwealth Bank, from Menzies, and I presumed I was coming up to get sacked. And Menzies looked at me and said, I really like this full employment and low inflation. If you stay on, can you give us full employment and low inflation? And Combs said, yes. And Menzies said, okay, well, if you just keep doing that, you won't hear much from me. So he did it for the next 20 years. And Combs and Crawford didn't expect unemployment of 2%, which they got. They were marvellously surprised. If we start doing the right thing, we might be marvellously surprised.
Thanks, Ross. Thank you, Carl, because the next question coming from here was about technical aspects of a cash flow tax. So instead, let's hand to Carl Fitzgerald.
Hi, Ross. Thanks so much for a great speech. I was a little surprised that you said that US data is better than Australia's. We have that incredible separation of land from improvements, but I wanted to hear why you thought the American data was better, but also to hear what percentage of GDP you see rents consuming in Australia, America, and Europe.
Well, that last question would require a lot of work that I haven't done. And the excuse I'll give is not that it's not worth doing, it should be done, but for the last 16 years since the Premiers and the Prime Minister gave me that job on climate change, I've worked mainly on those things. So I'm not right up to the detail, but reading a book like Philippon's, I keep thinking, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a data series like this? Now, that's not very scientific, and maybe people who know the data better than me could get a lot further than me, and you actually do need to do the work to answer that question. But if rent is the difference between the return on costless investment and actual average returns on investment, the profit share of GDP, then if I put a number on it, everyone will think that's the number I think it is. Could easily be 15 or 20% of GDP.
Carl, I'm pretty sure it's my job to work out those numbers, so if you're trying to tell me what to do, please be more straight to my face next time. Yes, yep.
Yeah, no, that actually would be a terrific job. Philippon's done it for a set of things, mainly looking at conventional monopoly and oligopoly, but the comparison of Europe and America comes out very unfavourable for America. Someone taking that and comparing Australia with that would be a nicely structured thing that could be done.
23.6% GDP rents.
Well, if it was 23.6 then, it's more than 30 now.
Hi, Ross. Yeah, thank you. So a little bit similar to the first question from Tim. The commonly understood by a lot of people is that the business profit sits on one side of the coin, personal income sits on the other side of the coin, or income from labour sits on the other side of the coin. Whereas Georges, we understand it more to be business profits and income from labour on the same side of the coin, the rent collectors on the other side of the coin. So do you see that taking hold in the discourse anytime soon, or that understanding starting to improve and grow?
Well, it won't happen. It won't happen if no one makes the case. But I think
we're making the case.
Yeah. Well, I think it can be made. Well, the rent tax that we're proposing for business income won't have any tax on competitive small business, because on average, the profits and losses average themselves out, and it's only where you've got protection from government regulation or private monopoly or mineral rents or land rents that you get the high returns that will not be competed away by competition. So I think the case can be made. Well, to be fair to people playing in the current game, it's harder today than when Hawke was Prime Minister or Curtin or Chifley. They didn't have to deal with one foreign news business owning 70% of the Australian print media and setting the tone for a lot of the discussion. About a decade ago, there was a thesis at Oxford University, a PhD thesis, on why the spectrum of views on climate change, and it wouldn't be all that different on questions of rent, but why the spectrum of opinion in the community was in a different place in 3 countries, Britain, America and Australia, than it was in Europe and Japan and China and India. Skepticism was a non-belief in science was much more prominent in these 3 countries, and the conclusion was the exceptional influence of News Corp, of the Murdoch media, which was systematically, they did all the work, very hard to measure those things, so whether they're right or wrong, I don't know, but that was their conclusion. I think that's a big part of the story. Part of cleaning up the Australian policy-making process, I think, is support for public interest journalism, so we get more pluralism in reporting of economic facts.
Thanks, Professor Garnaut. Andrew Gunter, I'm an ordinary Prosper Australia member. Just wanted to pick up that comment you made about China and minerals. It was famously said by Kerry Packer that he only got one Alan Bond in his life. To what extent do Australian rent takers, particularly in minerals, but not just minerals, have only one China in their lives, or is it like Halley's Comet and it comes around again?
Well, there might have only been one. There might only be one Alan Bond in Kerry Packer's life, but boy, did it set him up for life. And if you're a Gina Reinhardt, whose father happened to peg the world's richest iron ore resources that were worth a little bit while he was alive, but the China boom made her the richest woman in the world. She's now buying all the cattle properties of Northern Australia, and you convert one source of rent into another. And the same is happening to a lot of the sources of rent in Australia. So actually that iron ore boom the iron ore riches will continue for quite a long time. There'll be several generations of heirs to those fortunes who do very well out of it. Might not be your own kids, the way from reading the newspapers, but when you've got access to untaxed rents in those huge quantities, you can set yourself up well. You also set yourself up by buying politics. You know, Gina is the main supporter of the IPA, which I presume is a nemesis of this society. I don't know, but I would guess. Yeah.
Without wishing to open a huge can of worms, I think we sit nowhere on the political spectrum, in essence. But that's something for another day. I'd like you all, I think unfortunately we're probably out of time for questions, so I'd just like to again thank Professor Garnaut for his, incredible commitment to supporting us here tonight and to speaking to you all. Thank you for your attention, thank you for your questions. We hope you enjoy dessert, a cup of coffee, and perhaps join us downstairs for a drink. So finally, would you please join me again in thanking Professor Garnaut for being here tonight?